Department of Defense, because we are forced to, not forced, but we're encouraged every 3 years in our development, we go to some sort of schooling. And so by meeting individuals in the field, getting the academics every couple of years, it all starts to blend together. So after you do 35 years like I have, I've been in 6 years of combat. I've served in, I've been to 92 nations, and 6 of those nations didn't invite me. I didn't have a passport. So there's a wealth of different kinds of personal experience. So the experiential side of this is my strength, but my weakness is making sure that I can tie that back into the academics. That is why a man my age is in the program here for the leadership, the ILD course, and participating in my age, because what I want to do is I want to weave back into understanding where a lot of these things came from and be able to articulate them in a more scholarly fashion. And so I will tell you that you'll hear things tonight, and hopefully you'll engage with me on some of these things. But, Simon Sinek in his 2 books, always start with why, and Leaders Eat Last. Of course, we taught him to always ask why. He took it to a different level, which was really interesting. And Leaders Eat Last means something completely different in the Army than what he wrote about, what I like what he wrote about. Because he took it with his experience and made it his own. With Goleman, with his 5 elements or the components, depending upon how you read it, of emotional intelligence. And just so you all know, the 5 that I advocate for are self-awareness, empathy, self-regulation, social skills or social intelligence, and motivation. And of those 5, what I like to talk to people for the first time at the beginning is the self-awareness piece of it. And the self-awareness piece of it, that's where Sun Tzu comes in. So as I said, the acme of skill in war is to win without a fight. We train people to use the most important weapon system they have in the Army, and that's the gray matter between your ears. If you can find a way to save treasure, save lives, and prevent conflict, then try that first, but be prepared for the worst case. That is a Sun Tzuian quote, if you allow me to say Sun Tzuian. We all know Sun Tzu is not a person. It is a 800-year, collage or accumulation of Chinese parables and proverbs about war, best practices, good ideas, and whatnot. But within that, there is one saying that I think is very applicable to what we're getting ready to kind of talk through, which applies directly to self-awareness. Sun Tzu, right up front, says, to know yourself and to know your enemy is to see no peril in 100 battles. To know yourself, but not know your enemy, you might win, you might be lucky 50% of the time. To not know yourself and not know your enemy, you are doomed to failure. Well, in the world that I come from, we use that saying for many things, and specifically for emotional intelligence. It was, if you know yourself and you know those either who you lead or those who you are following, then chances are that team will be very successful. If you know yourself, but you don't understand your team and you don't understand your leader, chances are you might get it right once in a while. But if you don't know yourself and you don't know your leader, that team is doomed to failure. And that is what I've taught young leaders for the last 45 years. To give you context, my first job in the Army as lieutenant, I had 34 soldiers. My last job in the Army, I had 357,000 soldiers, Department of the Army civilians, contractors, faculty, that circumvented the earth with over 150 installations. And so these analogies that I'm going to give you, this comparison I'm going to give you, the story I'm going to tell you, I have found to be highly applicable in multiple different environments with multiple different cultures and a vast majority of people that I've worked with. Hasn't always been perfect, but I've always blamed it on myself by not knowing that person well enough to be able to draw conclusions, how to motivate them and make them the best person I possibly could. So to do that, and do what some of you have done for me as my instructors, and I appreciate it, I think the best way to do this is to tell a story. And what I hope you can draw from this story is to think about yourself. And what, there's two people I'm going to use, to two extremes. And I'm going to use Myers-Briggs as an example, because most people are familiar with at least introverts and extroverts. The sensing and intuitive, the second letter in that discussion, is actually more important for leading people than introversion and extroversion. But that's a whole different topic. But that said, I'd like to start tonight with introversion and extroversion. And to do that best, I have to tell a life story as a young college student who met his future wife, not knowing at that particular time much about myself, and definitely not knowing much about her, or having any comparison from an educator or an adult figure in my life to give me some insight to understand why I was so dramatically different than her. And so the story goes like this. So on a Friday afternoon, when my energy level was about 50%, walking out of my last class on campus that day, I walk out the front door of Garrett Strong, which was the building I was taking classes in, and I bump into one of my fraternity brothers, who looks at me and says, "Hey, Chris, there's a party at Kevin's at 6 o'clock. And I take enough time to look at my watch and realize it's 3:05. And I go, "Great." And I say, "Thanks." And my battery, my human energy battery from that short conversation, where I was sitting at about 50% of my energy level, because the classes have taken it out of me, I'm doing things that don't excite me, and it's draining my energy, my personal energy within my body and my mental state. The moment somebody said party, it's extemporaneous, wasn't planned for me as an extrovert at that time, in the high 80s from my first Myers-Briggs, which is way off the chart. Nobody wants to hang out with somebody in the high 80s, especially if they're an introvert in the high 70s, which I didn't know it at the time was my girlfriend, now my wife. And so as I'm told, party 3 hours, less than 3 hours, my energy skyrockets to the 90 percentile. My energy jumps even more when I notice my new girlfriend walking across campus, who I immediately make a beeline to invite her to that party, which she has to be excited about, right? And so I beeline over to her, and I intercept her coming out of her class, and not realizing she's probably somewhere around 50% as well. And I say, "Look, there's a party at Kevin's. It's at 6. I'll tell you what, let's not wait till then. I'll pick you up at 5. I'll see you in a little bit. I'm gonna run home, take a shower. I'll be at your dorm and I'll pick you up." I don't even think that there's a question that should be involved. I don't think much about the detail. I assume, based upon my personality, that would be exciting for her as well. Realizing, later in life, that she was 71% and still remains somewhere in the mid 60s in terms of introversion. And she's also a sensor, which those of you who understand Myers-Briggs and are trained to evaluate that know that that's a very methodical, lockstep, A plus B = C person who has to have planning and has to think things through before they can execute. I've left her standing there, and I'm moving out, and I'm going to expect her to be ready to go in very short order. Now, as you can imagine, those of you who are introverts, I have really put her in a very awkward situation where my energy level is now skyrocketing. Hers is plummeted, and it's plummeted down to probably what we call in an energy level for an introvert, their red line. And a red line is the chemical, physical, emotional point in the battery of energy for an introvert that almost brings them to their knees. It makes them sick. It makes them irritated. It makes them emotionally very insecure at that particular moment in time. What I didn't understand at the time were the lessons that I now teach, which is in that encounter, the counter that got me excited, I should have known to take the time to ask a number of questions. Specifically, and if you're an introvert and I can get a nonverbal, I'll bet you the most important question is, when is the party over? And the reason that they want to know the party is over is because I've given them a start point They need to know what the endpoint is so they can figure out how to build enough energy to survive the event. Because the moment they get there, their energy begins to deplete, and it is not a comfortable or fun event for them. And so what I eventually learned and what I eventually taught afterwards is ask the right questions to help the introvert, and be self-aware enough to know what excites you definitely doesn't excite them. If in fact you're dating an introvert, or if you have an employee or someone you're working with who's an introvert. When I walked away and I left her in a bad place. Most students I talk to, or most employees I talk to, when we interact, I would say, what would your answer be? 90% of the time, the answer would be no, I'm not going. And that would be the end of the conversation. And so what I've learned is I have to ask a number of questions. I have to set the right conditions. And if I'm really self-aware and I am socially aware of what she needs, I will make sure she has ample time, because as I have learned that introvert needs some isolation, a real introvert who is mature in what they need has set routines. Some will go for a run, some will read a book, some will go back to a place of isolation. What I learned eventually with my wife, and it took me many years to figure this one out, I would watch my wife fold laundry in the front room, and then when she was done, she would dump it back out and fold it again, which I always thought was a little odd, until I realized that was her mechanism for being in her zone of isolation to build her energy back. It was a comfort for her that allowed her to build energy to be able to withstand me. Okay. And it wasn't anything against me. It was just a technique that she had developed. So with college students, we talk about running isolation. Interesting enough, college students, the number one introverted technique seems to be going back to the room and taking a nap. And so we talk about how that is not something that's going to translate well into the workforce, and they need to find other things that get them that same kind of ability to build themselves up. So in that particular step of the story, I failed by not understanding what she would need, and at the same time, she failed by not giving me the opportunity to know what it was that she needed to be most successful. And that's because we were both not very self-aware or socially aware at the time that we could do that with each other. So as the story progresses, I do pick her up. I actually show up even earlier than I told her I would. So I have not given her enough time to get above her red line very far. So she does take time to say, look, what time is this party going to be over? Which for me as an extrovert is an early warning sign that she's upset about something. Or that's when I start to go, I wonder why she's mad. I wonder why she's upset. I wonder what I did wrong, because now she wants to know when it's going to be over, when that isn't even a consideration for me. And so what I will do is I'll go, oh, okay, we'll be back by midnight. And I've given her a mark on the wall. Now, what I worked with my wife over time, that mark would usually be brought back another hour to 2 hours. And if that wasn't okay, we didn't go. But she was like, okay, so midnight will be good. For me, that's just an arbitrary thing to get her to go. It's not an actual deadline. So we go to the party, and we get into the party. We walk in the front door, and it's a large room. Now, I have not set the conditions by asking further questions earlier, like who's going to be there? How many people are going to be there? Is there food going to be served? What is the theme? What are people wearing? Does she know anybody there? Large group, small group. All of those things help her prepare mentally and physically for the endurance of being able to go there and have enough energy to survive the period of time from arrival until midnight. In the room, what I normally show the students is there's a large room with about 100 people in the middle, which completely catches her off guard. I didn't know how many people are going to be there. I'm a little surprised, but for me, that's a target-rich environment. I'm pretty excited when I see 100 people. When you ask the introvert, where are they going to go in that room, when there's food in one corner, there's a bar in one corner, there's a seating area in the other corner, And then there's a small den off the edge of the large room that's got some bookshelves in there and a TV and a couple couches and a chair. Most introverts, again, I'm trying not to generalize, but most introverts, and I've been doing this for a long time, will immediately move toward, many will go get a drink. Others will get the food, move to the wall, and search for somebody that they're comfortable with, and then stay somewhere along the wall. They will not wander out into the masses. So the introvert goes left. The extrovert, especially someone who's as extreme as myself, I'm like a busy bee going into a flower field. I'm going to go in and I'm going to go in and pollinate as many of those flowers as I can. I'm going to talk to every single person that's on that floor, whether I know them or not. And I am not going to have one single substantive conversation when I'm out there. I'm going to talk about superfluous, random things with a bunch of people, and I'm going to gain a lot of energy from that. And I'm going to get more spun up, enjoy it. And just the whole idea of being on that floor, talking to 100 people gets me jazzed up. What happens for me is time slows down, or excuse me, time speeds up. And for my girlfriend, who's been against the wall, who I haven't spoken to in 4 hours, time has drug on and on and on for her. And at some point, I eventually look up well after midnight, because again, it was an arbitrary thing for me. It wasn't a real deadline. I look up and I realize I don't see her anywhere. And so I at least get concerned about that and start looking for her. And as I'm looking for her, I don't know, Leah, I would be really curious where you would be, but I will just go quickly because we don't have much time. Marguerite is in that room, and she's in there on the couch in the low lit room with the TV going. Back then it was actually, there was no shows on because all the channels were off air by midnight, but she's in there just sitting there, and I can see her through the door, and there's usually 1 or 2 other people in there with her, and nobody's talking to each other. They're all just sitting in there. And so me as the extrovert, and I don't know how many of you are extroverts, when we see them in that state, we immediately think something's wrong, and we have to go in there and save them. We've got to go in and say, what's wrong? What did they do? Did somebody upset you? Are you okay? Did I do something wrong? And we immediately bombard them with exactly what they don't need. What we don't realize is they're in that room because we have missed that deadline. They're approaching their red line battery, and they're in there trying to survive long enough for you to understand and get them out of there. But what do? We drag them out into the middle of 100 people and start introducing them around. We shove more food in their hand. We shove another drink in their hand, and we forcibly want them to have fun. And we're having the exact opposite effect of what we think they need, until we get to the point where we suddenly realize, and we make that conclusion as the extrovert, they're upset. We begin to blame ourselves. I have done something wrong. So we get the coat, we leave, we reluctantly say goodbye to everybody because we still want to stay. We get out on the porch, and immediately I try to fix this by saying, hey, it's all night pancake night at the hitching post. 5 or 6 guys are meeting there. You want to go there and get some pancakes, thinking maybe that'll save the situation. And all I've done now is made it completely shut down. And she says, no, take me to the res halls. Take me back to my room. And now I begin what is called the extrovert spiral of death. That is not something you can scholarly quote anywhere. I've made that word up. Okay. But it is exactly what happens to an extrovert. We spiral into the worst case scenario. Okay. I've done something wrong. I've upset her. I. So we begin to ask the question as you're walking across the grass to the car, As you open the door, let her in, you get in the car. What is wrong? What did I do? How can I fix this? I'm sorry. I don't know what I did. Are you mad? And we begin that, just filtering them with these questions of, what did we do? And all we're doing is causing it to get worse. And now, just for fun, and there's some movies that are great at this. I mean, Fargo, there's a great scene in the movie Fargo. Many of you are too young to remember that show, but the extrovert in there is talking to the introvert, and he says, I'll tell you what, I'll show you. If you're not going to talk to me, I'm not going to talk to you. We'll give you a little of your own medicine. Well, I tried that many times and just said, all right, fine. It's a 15-mile drive back. I'm not going to talk to you for the first 5 miles. And we don't make it very long, do we, Eli? we make it maybe 2 minutes, and we can't. We snap. Fine, I'll show her. I won't talk to her, but we cannot not talk, because we have, in that spiral of death, extroverts have a huge issue. We have a need. The introvert has the need for isolation to build, recharge, and stay healthy. The extrovert has to solve a problem. And the problem has to be solved based on our maturity, our training, our education. It has to be solved right now. Okay? It cannot fester. It has to be solved. It has to be moved past for us to let go. Okay? Unless we understand that we're on this spiral. Now, in the date scenario with me, I didn't shut up. I did turn it into a fight. It was never a fight. I mean, it normally starts with this one word that extroverts hate. When you ask an introvert how they're doing and they say fine, the word fine is not good in the eyes of an extrovert. The word fine means there's something terribly, terribly wrong. And then if you use that word, we're going to come after you like a shark in bloody waters to figure out why you're just fine, because we want you to be great, because that's how we feel. And we don't understand why you're just fine. Fine is bad. And so eventually what happens is we cause the fight. We cause the complete breakdown, get her back to the dorms. She leaves. I sit out in the car. She can go in and literally be back in her safe space, start folding laundry or whatever it is that she has to do to get back to normal, but she can compartmentalize me. She sets me on a shelf and she doesn't think anything about me. Back then, she didn't have a cell phone, but these kids today, these people will turn off their phone and set it over there, or they'll plug in a charger and turn it on silent and leave it sit to get that isolation. Meanwhile, sitting out of the car, the extrovert can't let it go, because the extrovert knows they're going to be tortured all night until they get it fixed. For me, this is where the word needy comes from in a relationship. About 20 minutes later, I'm knocking on the door because I can't leave, because I know I cannot sleep because I'm so wound up on it. And so the next day, go over there first thing, doesn't want to see you. Luckily, later in the afternoon, she was kind enough to come out and see me. And we kind of started to understand each other. Okay. But it's a very difficult period of time. It's a very difficult situation to go through. So I'm going to stop there for a second and throw a slide up here and kind of take you through this real quick. Are there any questions or comments at this point that you guys want to bring up? Nope. Okay. Super quiet. So here's another example for you real quick to consider. And at the end, we're going to talk about how is this applicable to leadership? And I think intuitively you can see how this relates. But there's an old saying, and I don't know if many of you have heard this with the human battery. In the morning, an extrovert wakes up with zero money in their pocket. Okay. In the morning, an introvert wakes up with 10 silver dollars. And then as the day progresses, the extrovert maneuvers on the introvert to steal as many of their silver dollars as we can. Now, you introverts know who we are. We're the boss that comes in and sits on your desk and asks you about your weekend. We're the person that intercepts you at the water cooler and talks to you about the weather, or when was the last time you went fishing? The superfluous conversations that extroverts need to charge their batteries to get through the morning in order to get to an exciting afternoon. Meanwhile, you're trying to get your work done, stay in your cubicle, keep your head down. And what we're doing is we're dancing with you all day to steal your money. By the end of the workday, you are spent. By the end of the workday, I come down and sit on your desk and say, how many of you guys want to go get a beer tonight? Anybody want to go bowling? Some extemporaneous activity. Team building is the name we're calling it. And we're going to try to get you out of the office, and we're going to go do something together so we can know each other better and build our team. And if your leader doesn't understand a certain percentage of the population within the workforce is approaching their red line, they can misunderstand because their energy is so high and excited about something they just dreamed up when they look at you and you just stare at them funny, because they don't have an appreciation for what they're actually doing to you physically. And that is the fallacy of what the extrovert goes through when they see introverts who predominantly are deep thinking, well thought out, well-planned individuals who have great ideas, who don't share unless you work on certain techniques to get them to do so. That self-awareness that you don't have makes the work environment very uncomfortable for most. And then I ask you to go to that, get a drink afterwards. After we go down there, you're all the way down there to red line. You may go, but you may not be very fun, or you may tell me no. And my immediate instinct is, well, what a jerk. Okay. But what I don't understand is it's my fault for not understanding you. So therefore the relationship has failed. I don't understand you well enough. So 50% of the time I'm going to be wrong. So, and I'm going to skip there because this is back to the party. So in conclusion, in the spiral, can you see the spiral, Moises? Okay. And I can put this up here. And again, this is, we've talked about the needs of the introvert. The extrovert needs to solve problems. They need to do it immediately. They've got to have activity to build their batteries to feel as good as you do after you've done the things that build your energy. But this spiral of death goes back and forth. And what's wrong with this spiral is the feedback we get from the introvert is confusing to us. What's wrong? What did I do? I'm sorry. Whatever, and there is nothing we can do in this spiral until we understand what it is that motivates the individual besides yourself. So we get down to a certain point, and actually what happens is down in here, this is when the relationship breaks. The relationship breaks because it goes from the extrovert saying it's me to what ends up happening is the expert then says it's the introvert, and they blame them. And it usually gets pretty ugly down here because they don't understand why you've shut down on them. And it's that misunderstanding I have found that causes more problems in the workforce than just about anything else. So the needs of each of these is what I'd ask you to consider. For the extrovert, these are needs. These are not wants and desires or nice to haves. These are innate needs that exist in, and again, I'm talking about extreme extroverts. Realizing if you take the Myers-Briggs assessment, there's a 10% buffer factor on either way, 10% to extrovert, 10% to introvert. That zone is called an ambivert. That is an individual that doesn't have a strong propensity for either, but can go either way. When I'm talking about extroverts, I'm talking 20, 30, 50% and above. But we have a strong need to fix things. We can't let them fester. And as a result of that, we become very irritating to others. So that fixing it right now, we have to talk it out. We have to understand what it is we've done. And having more emotional intelligence in terms of self-awareness, we can begin to understand that this person's shut down because I am approaching them incorrectly. The introvert, at the same time, while I'm trying to fix this, is trying to get to a place of comfort. Normally, some form of isolation to get away from what it is that is draining that battery. so they can process and decompress whatever it is causing the problem. And the big thing for me to understand is when to stop talking. Okay. So having said that, I'm going to stop there at the 35-minute mark, which Moises told me I had to do, and I'm a good student, and see if there's any questions or comments. I'm even more interested in anybody who disagrees, so we can talk it out.
Patricia.
Patricia looks like she's trying to unmute.
I am. Thank you
There you
so
go.
much. Chris, thank you so much for that, your presentation, and for the work that I do, particularly with the leadership through a leadership lens, is emotional intelligence with a combination of diversity and inclusion. So EIDI is the acronym that's used. And I'm curious, because as you discussed, one of the things that often happens, and particularly in the workplace or in a group dynamic, is that we have various generations that where emotional intelligence may have been experienced very differently. And so you have multiple ways of interacting from a leadership lens or from a team dynamic. So follower versus leader. So I'm wondering, where does that come in? Because just even today at work, there's a lot of conflict that's happening. And one of the things that came to me was the emotional intelligence, as well as situational leadership styles, and a generational, different generations that are coming into the space. So my question is that how does emotional intelligence play out, or have you experienced emotional intelligence with a number of generations that are coming into the workplace?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because the vast majority of my workforce was 18 to 25. And what I found was, within emotional intelligence, the empathy piece of it is critical, because the empathy piece leads to more of a vulnerable leader or a servant leader style. Now, like Brother Goldman has articulated so well in one of his best books, which is the Leadership and the Power of Emotional Intelligence, which is actually a pamphlet that's about this big. In there, he talks about emotional intelligence. He talks about leadership styles, 6 leadership styles that he advocates for, that are not necessarily the ones I advocate for. But the 6 styles, the point he makes is, good leaders have 1 or 2 leadership styles. Above average leaders will have 3 to 4. Exceptional leaders know how to use all 6 of his styles, and when to apply them and when they're most applicable. And he relates that to the golf club, the golf bag analogy, where he says, a golfer wouldn't play 18 holes of golf with 1 golf club. So having 1 or 2 styles is insufficient to have to be an effective leader, according to him, and I agree with him. And so with the younger generation, what I found, it was the vulnerability piece. I was actually chastised because as a general officer, we would have to go sit with, we called them the graybeards, and I guess I'm one of them now, but the graybeards would sit around and tell us, based upon assessments, we had 360-degree assessments. And one of the strengths that my assessment highlighted was accessibility and vulnerability, because I would go down and talk to young men and women and go, yeah, I did the same thing and it was really stupid, but here's what I learned, and I'm gonna offer it to you now. Or I would go down and say, I didn't know that. Explain that to me. Show me how that works. And be vulnerable enough to be able to admit, I just don't know how to do that. And that's what I found with this generation is that the current generations for me are the 3 that are stacked up in the queue now. They know things that I never would have known. And so it would be ridiculous for me to pretend like I do. And so being vulnerable enough to say, I don't understand how this works. Why don't you guys show me? It was always a really interesting technique for me to use. And I used to do that by what we would call management by wandering around, which is an old Deming technique, back with the Japanese, production lines, and Deming would say, get out and see the force. And so I had blocked times in my calendar 3 times a week, right? Nobody knew where I was going to go. I didn't know where I was going to go. And I would sit down and do something like, I think my favorite thing to do would be, imagine in a motor pool, thousands of pieces of equipment, and the youngest private in your organization is the kid, where you bring in the maintenance sheet that says you've done everything you can, and he dispatches the vehicle and hands you the keys so you can take a tank and go to the field with it. Well, I sat there and dispatched vehicles in a unit for a whole day before somebody.
Partner seminar going on. That's what I'm listening. Yeah.
Somebody's up there, but I'm kind of beating around, because the answer to your question is yes, and it's hard, and it takes a lot of personal investment. But I think from an emotional intelligence standpoint, it's being very self-aware and comfortable in yourself. It's being vulnerable. It's being accessible, and it's being able to, tell people the truth so you can build that trust. Now, these graybeard generals looked at me and said, that is a huge weakness. Never admit that you don't know something. You're supposed to know everything. And if you don't know it, you never admit it. You go figure out what it is, and then you do it. And I'd say, well, with all due respect, I disagree. I'd rather have the smartest person in the world execute it for me than go do it half-assed myself. And that to me always seemed to resonate with whatever generation I was talking to. Does that help? Does that answer your question? Thank you. Great question, though. But if you start talking about diversity, I would, I would love to talk to you about how to do that from a diversity standpoint as well, being an old white guy who's received a number of awards for diversity. But the big thing for me was, the smartest thing that ever happened to me in college was I joined Omega Sci-Fi. And so I'm a Q dog. And that always surprised the heck out of people. And some of the people on here don't know what that means. But what really was interesting about that experience was, years later, when I commanded all the ROTC programs on the face of the earth, we were trying to get more African-American males. We had plenty of African-American females in the Army, and we were meeting our percentages. We were well over 13, 14%, which was the percentages that I was asked to try to achieve. But I was around 8% for males. And so what I did was I went and recruited from all of the Black fraternity conclaves. And my white peers had no idea what that was. And so I went and met with the Divine Nine at their annual convention. I got their blessing, and I worked with them and the National Association of Black Broadcasters of America. And we went out, we got them scholarships, and we tripled our numbers in 18 months. But that's how you do diversity, is you step out of your comfort zone. You do other things that others don't expect you to do and or know, which was always the fun part of it, to throw up a hand sign or mess with the deltas and have them get really upset. So most people here don't know what we're talking about. Anybody else?
There is
Chris,
a question.
Yeah, I know that there's one on for Carol and Nia that
Oh, I'm
has
sorry.
up there too, but I just wanted to jump in, and since you're talking about diversity, I'm curious what you think about the distinction between extroversion and neurodiversity, such as ADHD or autism or any of those neurodiverse conditions.
So yeah, so Candace is going to drag me out because she knows she taught me about neurodiversity this last class, which incidentally I still studying and probably going to do my dissertation on, because I had no idea what I didn't know. I think it plays a huge role, especially, I'm dyslexic, like most dyslexic that I've read about in my studies in Candace's last course. We're not diagnosed until later in life. And so we have a lot of baggage with us. And so from a neurodiversity standpoint, in terms of dyslexia, I can talk a little bit about, ADHD and Asperger's and the others in that spectrum, I'm not well versed in. But I think, Candace, I think there's a huge role in those perceptions, because I can see the same things where as a dyslexic person, I can come across as very like trying to pretend to be the smartest person in the room, try to drive the conversation. Because as you know, people with dyslexia can see multiple options and connect multiple things nearly simultaneously because they're seeing in pictures. I love that one study from Ron Davis that you and I looked at, or at least that you encouraged me to look at, where he talks about a diverse person, a person with dyslexia sees average person with dyslexia sees 32 pictures per second. The average neurotypical person sees 200 words per second. And so if you take the amount of information in those 32 pictures, it's somewhere around 4,000 times more information processed in a second between a neurodiverse and a neurotypical person, especially somebody with dyslexia. So when people were explaining things to me, my lack of self-awareness when I was younger was to poo-poo the details because I could see a bigger picture. And I wanted to move to that bigger picture, and I wanted to skip the detail of getting there. And therefore, that caused me many, many problems as I grew up, because I could see the end, but I could not see the path. I just knew that's the path that I wanted to pursue. So I think that is another dynamic. There's so many more dynamics than extroversion and introversion. I mean, let me ask you, Candace, have you ever been accused of cutting corners in your life?
No, never.
I assure you she hasn't, Chris.
And for those of us who have been accused of cutting corners, is it a positive or a negative thing to be accused of? Anybody besides me been accused of cutting corners? To me, it was a great insult. Okay. And I teach this, Candace, that, you know, in the Myers-Briggs, it's the sensing person, where if I say, you know, on my screen here, you know, you're at the bottom over here and there's a house over here in the top quadrant. And the box that's my face is in is a road to get there. And I say, go to 504 Maple Street, and the street you're on is Elm, and the street over there where the house is Maple. Will you cut the corner and walk straight to the house? Or will you take the road to get there? Which way would you go, Candace? You're going to cut, or you're going to walk down the street to the corner and take a right to 504 Maple?
Moises is laughing. Why am I going to the house?
Yeah, there we go.
Is it on fire? Is somebody needing something? I will cut through every lawn to get there
Yeah.
quickly. If I'm just taking a stroll, I will not jaywalk at all.
So you put much more thought in it in 1 nanosecond than I ever have. You know, so what I explain to people, there are people in your organization who are sensing, who are going to go right down that street, get to the corner, go right up that street and get to the house, because it's guaranteed they're going to get there because it's 504. It makes perfect, logical, sequential sense to go there. Someone like me, the address and everything is irrelevant. They pointed at the house. I'm just going to walk across that empty lot between here and there. Now, I don't know if there's a creek in there. I don't know if there's snow in there. I don't know if there's a Doberman pincher in there. I don't know what's in that lot, but that doesn't come into the equation for me. For me, you know, the shortest distance, 2 points is a straight line. So I'm going to cut the corner. And what you want when you're working with a team is find out who's going to cut the corner and who's going to take the corner, and then figure out how do you bring those two kinds of individuals to the center, the sweet spot, somewhere between the corner and the lot. Because if an organization, everybody's going to that corner and up to there, guess what? It's too slow, and they're not going to stay ahead of the competition. If everybody's cutting corner and not doing their homework, then you're going to crash and burn because you don't know the risk that you're taking. So as the leader, understanding self-awareness, to understand your people, social awareness is to figure out what makes them tick. What is the empathy? That person must take that corner. So you know what? If the house is on fire, I'm not going to send somebody who has to go to the corner. I'm going to send somebody who is okay running through the unknown to go put the house out or save the people that's in the house. if I want to go paint the house in 3 weeks and I want it done to a high quality, I'm going to pick the corner person to go do it, because they're going to plan it out. They're going to get the paint. They're going to pay all the bills. They're going to know exactly where to go. They're going to show up on time. They're going to have a plan to paint the house. Don't send me to paint the house. I'll go over the day and I'll slop some paint on it. So it's understanding that dynamic of the difference between an intuitive person and a sensing person, which again is a part of the emotional intelligence persona, if you would, or spectrum.
Yeah, and I think you've made some excellent points about teamwork, right? And we need many different people on the team. So we do need the captain who will take the corners appropriately on that fire team. And we also need the whatever those other names of those people on the team are. But we need the captain who's organized and thinking through all of the different steps before and after, and the
Yep.
ones that are, getting to the fire as quickly as possible. So I think you make some good points, and that we also need to be very aware of our individual EI and our individual neurodiverse skills and
Mhm.
talents, and bring all of those, as we talked about in our class, all of that diverse talent to the teams. So thank you for this evening, Chris. I'll let other people ask some questions.
I see chats. I'm not doing my job. Am I supposed to be looking at these?
Let me just say a little bit, like in my own experience, really bringing the cultural component into this. I remember when people will tell me, when I moved, originally from Mexico, I grew up in Mexico. I came to the States when I was in my late 20s. And people will ask me, even now, what do you miss the most, from Mexico? And one of the things I miss the most is the sense of boundaries. Whenever my energy was going down, I knew I can stop to visit anybody, whether it's in their offices or whatever, because the sense of boundaries in Mexico is not as strong as here, So I would just go and visit someone working in another office or someone in another office, and I just knew, because of the culture, that they will stop doing whatever they're doing to talk with me,
Mhm.
And it was just, but then, when I came to the States, that was difficult because a sense of boundaries, it's a stronger sense of boundaries. So I had to really learn about that. And so explore other possibilities as an extrovert to actually really, get the battery re-energized. And the other thing, when I say that, when I think about that, and so when I'm focused, like, working on when I was working on my dissertation on a paper or something, and I'm focused, I just know my energy is going down, 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 because I'm by myself, and I have to be focused, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to do anything. But then, so after that, an hour or two of focusing, oh my God, I'm like, I drained, my energy is way down. So that's why, like really, like academic work and everything for me is work, because for me I would rather be like a butterfly, talking with people and everything, because but I won't be able to accomplish anything. So I had to really learn to deal with the uncomfortability of having my battery kind of low.
Yep. I had to learn rigor threefold. To survive in the Army, I had to get through all of the mechanical geometry of the battlefield kind of stuff. I hated it. I got really good at it, but I hated it. But you bring up a good point. I was mentoring a university a couple of years ago where their motto was every student, every day. Every student, every day. And the way that was interpreted by the faculty and staff is if they were locking the door, leaving for the evening, and a student showed up who missed an appointment, they had to stop what they were doing and succumb to the student's tardiness, because their focus was the student. And I understood what the president meant by the motto, but when I got there, the amount of people who were quitting was significant, quitting and moving to other places. And a very quick assessment of those who had either left or those who were leaving were people who didn't, they couldn't get their work done during the workday because they were in a constant state of interruption, because there was no discipline associated with things, because the motto meant that no matter what you were doing, you had to stop and take the student's question. You had to stop and go help the student. And like I said, office hours, the students didn't even worry about it. They just showed up whenever because they knew the faculty would respond to that. And what that did was it ate up the introverts in their organization because there was no plan, there was no structure, there's no ability to recharge and to plan. You know, if you got 5 hours of office hour plan, do you know how much energy you're going to need? And so when it was pointed out to the board and it was pointed out to the president, they really hated changing the motto, but what they realized, something as simple as that was destroying the welfare of the organization. So, yeah.
But yeah, you know, I just wonder, you know, this Carol has a question, so I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but it's like, how has your wife learned to cope with you? No, but you didn't say like to cope with your extrovert in public.
Well, I can't speak for her, but she stayed with me for 44 years. And so.
But how has she coped?
How has she coped with it? She quilts. And I think the best thing I ever did was I just shouldn't say it that way.
But in public, this is.
We decided to have separate but joint checking accounts. And so whatever she spends her money on is none of my business. And the best part of it is what she uses that money for is how she compensates for me, which is she has the entire second floor of our retirement home is her quilting emporium. She'll sit up there and cut quilt stuff in little squares and sew them together. And she's got the huge long arm thing and she's making these things. And then she turns and she gives them away. It drives me crazy, but it's none of my business. I don't go up there. And even the cleaning team that I finally talked her into is not allowed to go up there and clean. So that's how she does it.
And how about when the both of you are in public, in social lives?
Rarely do we go in public. And that's because I asked her to support me as a general officer to be on display with me for many, many, many years. And our last assignment was our last assignment because I said, look, if you do this for me one more time, I promise I'll retire, even though they wanted us to stay. But we literally, when the cadets would arrive around the world to Fort Knox, Kentucky at the beginning of May, we would have 16,000 of them trained until the middle of September. Unit after unit after unit. They started every 3 days and graduated every 3 days after the first 32 days. And every VIP and every person in the world came to see them. So we had a 8,600 foot square home. We had downstairs servants, cooks, upstairs servants, and we entertained 5 nights a week. And so she was able to do it. Now, remember, the reason I didn't know, well, not remember, fact, I didn't know she was a introvert because she was the president of her sorority when I met her. Okay. And so I was duped into thinking that she was an extrovert. Let's just put it that way, because how can somebody actually be in charge of a sorority and be elected and go through all the stuff that sororities go through? She had like 300 kids in her sorority and she was the president. Who would have ever thought? But that's because that is a fallacy. Just because somebody is outgoing and can do it, and she can do it, but when it's over, get out of the way. Dogs, kids, goldfish, everybody moves to the other side of the house and you give her that space. And it isn't because she's pissed, which is what I used to think. It's because she needs it. Now that's easy for me to eventually evolve and understand, to give her that space and give her those tools that she needs. I didn't give it to her. She did it herself. But it's interesting trying to explain it to other people, especially my parents. My parents didn't understand why when she would come visit, my mom was just like me. She sat in a corner and read a book from the moment she got there to the moment we left. And they thought she was rude, that she was rude and she was antisocial. They thought all the negative things. And really what it was a survival tool for her to support me and come see my parents.
So we have a couple of minutes for another question. Anybody? Another questions? If you have another question before we finish.
Thanks, Carol. I agree. Wherever Carol is. Okay, Leah, I didn't do as well as you did in your TED Talks, but I did my homework. I hope it. Yes, sir.
Thank
Ben.
you, Chris.
Is it Ben? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's Ben. I wanted to ask something, a quick question. curiosity. There are some personality that present, I don't know how to put it across. It's like, if you go to a segment of people, they would say, so and so is an introvert. You go to another segment of people, they would say, you're saying Gutierrez is an introvert? No, extrovert? No, he's an introvert. So
Yeah.
you have all these mixed perceptions that unravel.
Well, what's interesting is,
And yeah, so that variation of a personality belonging to these two different categories, to two different persons, it is something I'm curious to know.
yeah, and you know, the best example I can give you, Ben, is my son-in-law. When they moved back from Africa, my daughter and he moved back from Africa with their kids, and were living in my house for the six months as they transitioned back into the U.S. Society, as they found jobs. He saw me doing this at the Army University as an elective, and he came in and said, well, you know, blah 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 blah, and I'm an extrovert. And I started laughing. He said, why are you laughing? I said, because my gut tells me you're not. You have some tremendous communication skills and you're very personable. I said, but I think you're an introvert. And he said, well, I think you're wrong. And I said, well, there's only one way I know how to solve this, is sit down and take the Myers-Briggs test. It's just, I mean, that's a test. It's an assessment. So give it a shot and see what it tells us. Maybe I'm wrong. You know, I'm not the guru. And he said, okay. And he sat down, and it was funny because 30 minutes later, I walked by the kitchen and he's still, the dining room, and he's still sitting in the dining room and he's staring at the computer. And I go by about an hour, he's still staring at it. An hour and 45 minutes later, I came in and I said, are you still taking the assessment? And he said, yeah, but this assessment's flawed. It's absolutely flawed. And I go, well, what gives you that impression? He said, well, take this question, for example. He said, would you rather go to a party or read a book? And I said, okay, A or B. He goes, you can't select that. That is not enough information to draw a conclusion as to which of these I want to pick. I go, well, give me an example. He goes, well, what kind of a book? Is it a textbook? Is it fiction? Is it nonfiction? Do I like the author? Is it an author I'm forced to read? I don't know what kind of book they're talking about. What kind of a party is it? A big party, a small party, a private party, a costume party? What kind of party are you talking about? He said, see, it's an insufficient amount of information for me to make a logical conclusion. And I just laughed and walked out. But what I did from that was my social scientist and my behavioral scientist took him to class and studied him for a week, because what I wanted to find out was, is there a correlation to how long it takes somebody to actually take the test? You know, because he was a huge sensing person, like in the 80 percentile. And he was an ambivert when it came to being extroverted and introverted. That's why he could transcend the two, because he didn't realize that there was a middle ground of ambivert. Most people don't know that, but it was his sensing skills that were very fine-tuned for his logic. And so again, self-awareness, I think, is the key. And none of us are smart enough or intuitive enough, I don't think, to say, you know, Moises should be an introvert based on his mannerisms. That's another problem with social intelligence, is drawing biases and conclusions without actually either asking or testing or evaluating or assessing, and or just having a longer relationship with somebody to find out. Because you can ask a few questions. My big question in groups, normally what I would do in this session is I would split the introverts and extroverts in two different groups. And I would say to the extroverts, none of you can talk from this point on. And then I turn to the introverts and I say, I want you guys to get together and in 3 minutes, pick the most introverted person on this side of the room, single them out to me so I can bring them up front and ask them some questions. Wow, you want to try that one in your organization and see what happens? First off, the extroverts can't help themselves. They cannot not tell you who it is. They cannot shut up. They cannot sidebar with each other and giggle and point and laugh. You have to scold them. The introverts normally will all face forward and no one's going to rat each other out until eventually the least introverted person on that side of the room will volunteer to take the hit for everybody else. But nobody ever picks the most introverted person, because they're not going to do that to each other. It's an incredible dynamic to watch. But the question you can ask somebody in the work environment, which always exposes, or at least normally exposes, ask somebody in your organization how long they can go without feedback from their boss. Okay, Patricia, how long can you go without feedback from somebody in your organization who's in charge? Can you go a month? You know, you'd be surprised that some people say they don't need it at all. And then for somebody like me, you say, well, how long can you go? I go, 20, 30 minutes. I have to have feedback. I need feedback. Because if I don't get it, then clearly something's wrong. If an introvert, a real strong introvert, is getting no feedback, they believe that that's because they're doing well and there's no reason to have a conversation. If an extrovert's getting no feedback, that means something's terribly wrong and they're about to get fired. Those are two people sitting in your organization, and you know what? Extroverts, when they get mad, they don't talk to people. And then when we don't talk to them, they think they're doing well. Because
but also the other thing is a different environment. That's what's important. Like some different cultures, different environments. Yeah, I mean, you operate differently. But Alexis had a question.
Sorry.
And yes, the last one. Alexis.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I want to thank you for your service. I kind of put my question in the chat. It was really, I don't know if you kind of covered this, but as leaders, we recognize what emotional intelligence is. And I guess through our journeys, and Dr. Moisgood, as you mentioned, through your journey, moving to a different region, you recognized the differences in people and realizing what emotional intelligence is. But my thing is having an understanding of it. And to be honest with you, some of the analogies you made, I know that joining that organization, one thing for me, joining my organization taught me is how to deal with people with different personalities, right? But and I'm grateful for it. But as far as leaders, it's not so much about, I think it goes beyond just us understanding emotional intelligence, but we have to teach it to our people, right? And I was asking, what would you say are their best practices, if any, for actually sharing that knowledge with others around us, with our staff, with our coworkers, with our peers, and even sometimes with our bosses, right? How do we teach that, or if there are any best practices to do so? Please.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what my business does. One of my business that, we go in and we do that with offsites. But a lot of companies, a lot of organizations that I find, they'll have, it's a new term I'd not heard of until recently, chief experience officer. Normally the HR department should be doing developmental training within the organization. And one of those can be emotional intelligence, where they can either bring in an expert to take them through a scenario and teach them and expose that so they can all see it. Or the HR department should have developmental things that do that. What I found is, for example, and Moses knows this, one of my biggest difficult clients is a guy named Jeff Bezos, who doesn't believe in developing the workforce. And that's a problem we have in the United States, is we have a lot of companies that do very well financially, don't do well from a employee standpoint, because their strategy, their business strategy is use somebody until they're no longer effective for what I need them to do, and we throw them away. We don't develop them. The culture I came from, the Army consumes its own talent. We recruit it, we train it, we employ it, and we develop it over time. We don't hire people in at general off the street. We groom them over 30 years of development. So for us, it's a very natural thing. You have to develop your workforce. But some companies do it well, and some companies think it's unnecessary. And so it's very common to get, there's tons of different groups that do this. They'll come in and do an offsite. They'll come in, they'll do a training session. In fact, I did one at Clarkson College yesterday with the leadership team. And we did this. We did a 3-hour session on emotional intelligence. And what was interesting about it is the president, who had some problems with people, didn't understand that she was an extreme extrovert and very, very intuitive. And almost every single one of her VPs were introverted. In fact, one was the most interesting dynamic I've ever seen. She was 86% introverted, 72% sensing, 60-something% thinking, and over 93% judging. Now imagine a person who's thinking and judging, introverted and sensing. You can turn them loose on a project and they'll get it done, but they're not going to come in and tell you how they're doing. And they're not going to come in and tell you they need help when they do, because they'll figure it out themselves. And so I don't know, Alex, if I'm getting at answering your question, the leadership has a responsibility, in my opinion, to provide that kind of training or education to their workforce.
Thank you. So, essentially what I was looking at it is I work in, just to give you some background, I work in many grassroots organizations in different countries. So that's why I related a lot to Dr. Gutierrez's point. I'm in a foreign country now where there's a language barrier. So my thing is I kind of am the leadership, right? And I think a lot of us are in that position where we are the leadership and we have to make those decisions. So the question was more so, I guess, when you're saying getting training involved, it would kind of be, I guess, training myself to train others, right?
Yeah.
So yeah. Okay. So I think you did answer it. So thank you very much.
You bet.
But also another important thing is how can we model as individuals, as leaders, how can we model, emotional intelligence, in other countries and everything, like when I went back home after, to visit after a few years living in the States, and then I would stay away because I didn't want to disturb like my nephews or my sisters and everything because of a different sense of boundaries that I learned in the States. So when I went back, I was trying again like to visit my family using the American sense of boundaries, and my family and friends will say, "What's wrong with this guy? What was wrong with me?" Because then I was like I wasn't interrupting people. I wasn't, visiting people just for the sake of visiting, because I was. So that's when they clicked. So how can we model these moving back and forth from different cultures and different countries and different environments to be able to model, emotional intelligence. So anyway, so this is very good. Thank you, Chris, very much, and thank you everybody for joining us. We had a good number of people, coming and everything. And so in September we'll have another Jaytalk. We don't have the date set yet, but we'll have it soon. And I think Bernard is going to do. Looking forward to that. I don't know.
Moises, can I make an announcement about
Please.
one thing that's coming up in September, and everybody's invited. So I was just able to confirm late last week that Chris Lowney will come and speak to our EDD group again. So on September 28th, Thursday at 6 p.m. I just put the link onto the EDD student resource calendar. You'll get an email and a meeting invite. He's going to speak on courageous leadership. So it's a kickoff event for the Honor Society, but everybody's welcome, whether you're an Honor Society member or not. All students are welcome. So that's going to be coming up September 28th. I'll be sending out a message. So come listen and have a dialogue with Chris Lowney.
Well, thank you, everybody. Good night, everybody. And thank you, Chris, again, for taking the time to present to all of us.
Thanks for having me, Moises. Nice to meet everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everybody. Bye, Bernard. We'll talk.